The ghost of the Argonne. Colonel James Bull Hartley hadn't worn his uniform in 23 years. The khaki wool hung loose on his frame, a testament to age and the quiet life of a Montana cattle rancher. At 62, his hair had gone silver, his face weathered like the mountains surrounding his property. But his eyes, those steel-gray eyes that had witnessed the horrors of the Argonne forest in 1918, still burned with the fire of a man who understood war's brutal arithmetic. December 7th, 1941, changed everything. When news of Pearl Harbor crackled through his radio, Bull was mending fence posts in the frigid Montana wind. His hands, calloused from ranch work, had trembled as he listened to President Roosevelt's voice describing the Japanese attack. That night, he'd pulled his old footlocker from the barn, brushed off the dust, and stared at the Distinguished Service Cross nestled among faded photographs of men who never made it home. The telegram arrived 3 weeks later. The War Department needed experienced officers, especially those with tactical innovation experience. Bull's record from the Great War spoke volumes. He'd been a madman who'd figured out how to neutralize German machine gun nests using coordinated artillery and infantry maneuvers that seemed suicidal on paper but worked brilliantly in practice. Unconventional thinking for unconventional problems, his commander had written in his commendation. His wife Martha had known before he'd even opened the telegram. 40 years of marriage taught her to read the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when duty called. "You're going," she'd said simply, not a question, but an acknowledgement of the inevitable. Their 3 sons were already enlisted, 2 in the Army, 1 in the Navy. The Hartley family would do its part. Bull reported to Hamilton Field in California in January 1942. The base was chaos. Young pilots fresh from training, mechanics working around the clock, officers barking orders into telephones. Everyone was desperate, scrambling to respond to Japanese advances across the Pacific. The enemy seemed unstoppable, their Zero fighters outmaneuvering American planes with terrifying efficiency. His assignment confused him at first. They wanted him at a training facility, helping to prepare pilots for combat in the Pacific Theater. "Your experience with tactical problem-solving," the base commander explained, "could help our boys survive up there." Bull had nodded, but privately he'd wondered what a ground-pounder from the trenches could teach fighter pilots about aerial combat. The first time he watched American pilots train against each other, simulating dogfights with Japanese tactics, he felt something click in his mind, that same intuition that had kept him alive through the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Americans were brave, skilled, and determined. But they were fighting the Zero on the Zero's terms, trying to outturn and outclimb an aircraft specifically designed for exactly those maneuvers. That night, Bull couldn't sleep. He sat in the officers' mess hall long after everyone else had gone to bed, smoking his pipe and sketching diagrams on napkins. The problem gnawed at him like a hungry wolf. How do you beat an enemy that's faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who consider death in combat the highest honor? Conventional thinking wouldn't work. The Zero had been designed to dominate the Pacific skies, and so far, it was succeeding spectacularly. His mind drifted back to the Argonne, to the impossible situations that required impossible solutions. He remembered the German fortifications that couldn't be taken by direct assault, the machine gun positions that slaughtered entire companies. He remembered finding the answer not in matching the enemy's strength, but in exploiting their weaknesses, in making them commit to actions that seemed advantageous but were actually fatal. As dawn broke over Hamilton Field, Bull Hartley stubbed out his pipe and stared at the napkin covered in his chicken scratch notes. An idea was forming, something so unorthodox that it might just be insane enough to work. But first, he needed to understand the Zero better. He needed to think like a Japanese pilot, to see the world through their eyes, to find a crack in their armor. Understanding the enemy. Bull spent the next 3 weeks becoming an expert on the Mitsubishi A6M0. He interviewed every pilot who'd survived an encounter with the deadly fighter, read every intelligence report, studied every photograph and technical diagram the military had managed to acquire. What emerged was a portrait of an aircraft that was simultaneously magnificent and flawed, a masterpiece of Japanese engineering built on compromises that few Americans understood. The Zero was light, almost impossibly light. By stripping away armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, Japanese designers had created a fighter that could climb faster and turn tighter than anything America could field. In the hands of Japan's veteran pilots, who'd been honing their skills over China since 1937, it was a lethal weapon. American pilots were dying, and morale was plummeting. But Bull saw something others missed. Every advantage came with a corresponding vulnerability. The lack of armor meant a few solid hits could be catastrophic. The lightweight construction sacrificed durability for performance. The long-range fuel tanks that allowed Zeros to escort bombers across vast Pacific distances were vulnerable to fire. And the Japanese emphasis on dogfighting maneuverability meant the Zero was optimized for specific combat scenarios. Lieutenant Commander Michael Chun, a naval intelligence officer, became Bull's unlikely ally. Chin's parents had emigrated from China, and he'd studied Japanese military culture extensively. "You're looking at this wrong, Colonel," Chin explained one evening, spreading reconnaissance photos across a table. "The Zero isn't just an aircraft, it's an expression of Bushido, the warrior code. Japanese pilots are trained to seek close combat, to test their skill against opponents in turning battles." Bull leaned forward, studying the photos with renewed interest. "They want a dogfight. It's not just tactical, it's cultural." "Exactly," Chin confirmed. "Their training emphasizes individual combat prowess. A Zero pilot considers it honorable to defeat an enemy in a fair fight, demonstrating superior skill. They're conditioned to pursue enemies that flee, to accept challenges, to never back down from combat." This was the crack Bull had been searching for. The Zero's greatest strength, its maneuverability in dogfights, was also a psychological commitment. Japanese pilots were predictable not because they lacked skill, but because their cultural conditioning and training created consistent behavioral patterns. They could be baited, manipulated, drawn into situations that seemed favorable but were actually traps. Bull began developing his theory through exhaustive research. He studied samurai warfare, reading translated texts on Japanese military philosophy. He analyzed after-action reports, looking for patterns in how Zero pilots engaged American aircraft. He interviewed survivors who'd noticed quirks in Japanese tactics, how Zeros would circle back to finish off damaged planes, how they pursue fleeing aircraft even when tactically questionable, how they operated in coordinated groups but with individual pilots seeking personal glory. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that conventional aerial combat doctrine was playing into Japanese strengths. American pilots were being taught to dogfight, to mix it up with Zeros in turning battles where the Japanese aircraft had every advantage. It was like trying to outshoot a gunslinger in the Old West by using his preferred method of combat. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female officers at Hamilton Field, worked in logistics planning. She'd noticed Bull's obsessive research and approached him with curiosity. "Colonel Hartley, the pilots are talking. They say you're working on something big." Bull looked up from his notes, considering how much to share. Mitchell had a reputation for innovative supply chain solutions. "What if we stopped trying to beat the Zero at dogfighting? What if we made them come to us on our terms?" "Ow," Mitchell asked, pulling up a chair. "They're faster and more maneuverable. They dictate the engagement." "Not if we give them something they can't resist," Bull replied, tapping his pipe against the table. "Not if we exploit their predictability." Over the following days, Bull assembled a small team of officers who thought outside conventional parameters. Chun provided cultural and tactical intelligence. Mitchell helped analyze logistical requirements. Captain Robert Dutch Vandermeer, a bomber pilot who'd survived 3 runs over Pacific Islands, offered insights into Japanese fighter tactics from a bomber's perspective. Together, they began developing what would become known as the Hartley Protocol. The core concept was revolutionary. Stop trying to out-Zero the Zero. Instead, create conditions where the Zero's advantages became liabilities, where Japanese cultural conditioning and tactical training led pilots into carefully constructed kill zones. It would require perfect coordination, iron discipline, and a willingness to do something that seemed completely insane, intentionally making American aircraft appear vulnerable to draw Japanese fighters into a trap. The insane proposition. The conference room at Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor was filled with skeptical faces. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat at the head of the table, flanked by his top commanders. Bull Hartley stood before them in February 1942, presenting an idea that sounded like tactical suicide. "Let me understand this correctly, Colonel," Admiral Nimitz said, his voice measured and controlled. "You want to deliberately make our bombers appear crippled and vulnerable to lure Japanese fighters into a killing field?" "Yes, sir," Bull replied firmly. "But not just appear vulnerable. Actually be vulnerable, at least initially. The deception has to be authentic enough to convince Japanese pilots they're facing wounded prey." The room erupted in objections. "You're asking us to use our men as bait," one general shouted. "It's unethical, dangerous, and probably suicidal." Bull had expected resistance. "With respect, sir, what we're doing now is suicidal. We're losing pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate because we're fighting the zero on its terms. Every dogfight plays to Japanese advantages. My proposal gives us a fighting chance by changing the rules of engagement." He moved to a large map of the Pacific, pointing to specific locations. "The Japanese operate with predictable patterns. Their fighter sweeps follow established routes. They prioritize targets in a specific hierarchy, bombers first, then fighters, always pursuing damaged aircraft they believe are easy kills. This isn't a weakness in their tactics. It's a strength we can exploit." Commander Mitchell stood, distributing folders to each officer. "Colonel Hartley has compiled statistical analysis of every recorded zero engagement in the past 3 months. The behavioral patterns are remarkably consistent." Admiral Nimitz opened his folder, studying the data. Bull could see the wheels turning in the admiral's mind. Nimitz hadn't risen to command the Pacific Fleet by being conventional. He'd earned his position through strategic innovation and calculated risk-taking. "Explain the mechanics," Nimitz ordered. "How exactly would this work?" Bull approached a tactical board and began sketching. "We stage bomber formations that appear to be standard raids, B-17s or B-25s heading toward Japanese L targets. But we modify specific aircraft to simulate damage, trailing smoke, flying erratically, falling out of formation. Japanese doctrine virtually guarantees they'll send fighters to intercept, focusing particularly on the damaged aircraft. And then," Nimitz prompted, "then we ambush the ambushers," Bull continued. "High-altitude fighter cover remains hidden in cloud layers or sun glare. P-38s are ideal due to their climb rate and firepower. When Zeros descend to attack the crippled bombers, our fighters dive with altitude and speed advantages. But here's the critical element. We also position coordinated anti-aircraft batteries on escort vessels arranged in a specific pattern." Chin stood to add context. "Japanese pilots are trained to pursue individual victories. When they see vulnerable targets, their instinct is to break formation and attack. This cultural emphasis on personal combat prowess means they often commit to attack runs, even when tactically questionable." "You're describing a multi-layered trap," Nimitz observed. "Bait, concealed fighters, and coordinated AA fire." "Precisely," Bull confirmed. "But it only works if every element is perfectly synchronized. The bait has to be convincing. The fighters must maintain absolute discipline and not reveal themselves until the optimal moment. The AA batteries must fire in coordinated patterns that herd Zeros into kill zones rather than random defensive fire." A young captain raised his hand. "Colonel, Japanese pilots aren't fools. Won't they recognize the trap after the first time?" "They will," Bull acknowledged. "That's why this only works as a one-time, large-scale operation. We need to make them commit everything to what appears to be a vulnerable target. We need circumstances where they believe they've caught a major American formation in a desperate situation." Admiral Nimitz closed the folder and leaned back. "You're proposing we fake a major operational disaster to draw out the Japanese fighter force in strength?" "Yes, sir." "And then we systematically destroy them in a single coordinated action." The room fell silent. What Bull was suggesting required American bombers and their crews to fly into danger, to deliberately make themselves targets, trusting that the plan would work and that help would come. It required fighter pilots to watch their comrades appear to be under attack without immediately intervening. It required a level of coordination and discipline that was unprecedented in aerial warfare. The risk to the bait aircraft is extreme, another officer noted. You're asking men to trust their lives to perfect timing and execution. Bull nodded. I won't lie to you, sir. Men will die even if everything goes perfectly. But if we continue current tactics, we'll lose more men over a longer period with nothing to show for it. This gives us a chance to inflict catastrophic losses on Japanese fighter strength in one engagement, potentially shifting the balance of air power in the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz stood and walked to the map, studying the vastness of the Pacific theater. Bull knew what the admiral was thinking. America was losing slowly but surely. The Japanese controlled vast swaths of territory, and their air superiority enabled continued expansion. Conventional approaches weren't working. How many Zeros do you think we could destroy? Nimitz asked. Bull took a deep breath. If we execute perfectly, with ideal conditions and complete tactical surprise, between 100 and 200 aircraft. Building the trap. The authorization came through in early March 1942. Admiral Nimitz gave Bull Hartley 6 weeks to plan and prepare what became officially designated as Operation Broken Wing. The name was Bull's idea. It captured both the deception and the goal of crippling Japanese air power. Bull established his planning headquarters at Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor. The attack damage was still visible everywhere, blackened concrete, partially repaired hangars, sunken ships visible in the harbor. The sight motivated everyone involved. This wasn't theoretical. This was payback. The first challenge was selecting the bait aircraft. Bull needed bombers that could take punishment, maintain formation discipline, and realistically simulate damage without being genuinely crippled. After extensive testing, they settled on modified B-17 Flying Fortresses. Engineers developed smoke generators that could be activated remotely, creating the appearance of engine fires. They installed remotely operated control surfaces that could make aircraft yaw and pitch erratically while still maintaining overall control. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who was preparing for his own daring raid on Tokyo, visited the operation and offered advice. The key is making it look good from a distance, Doolittle explained to Bull. Zero pilots need to see smoke, erratic flight, separation from formation, all the signs of a wounded bomber trying to limp home. 32 B-17s were modified for the operation. Their crews underwent specialized training unlike anything in standard doctrine. They practiced flying formations that appeared ragged and disorganized while actually maintaining precise positioning. They learned to activate smoke generators at exact moments, to simulate panic communications on frequencies they knew Japanese intelligence monitored, to make every action look authentic while remaining coordinated. The fighter component was equally critical. Bull selected P-38 Lightning squadrons for their speed, firepower, and climb rate. But standard fighter tactics had to be completely reimagined. Instead of aggressive engagement, P-38 pilots trained to remain hidden, to resist every instinct to help when they saw bombers under attack, to wait for the exact moment Bull designated before diving into combat. Captain Dutch Vandermeer led the P-38 training program. It goes against everything we teach pilots, he told Bull during one training session. You're asking them to watch their brothers get shot at and do nothing. I'm asking them to trust the plan, Bull replied, and to understand that premature action dooms everyone. This only works with perfect discipline. The anti-aircraft component required unprecedented coordination. Bull worked with naval commanders to position destroyers and cruisers in a specific formation that created overlapping fields of fire without risking friendly aircraft. They developed color-coded flare systems so AA gunners could identify specific kill zones, firing patterns designed to drive attacking Zeros into designated areas rather than simply defending randomly. Commander Chun established an intelligence operation focused on identifying the optimal location and timing for the trap. They needed circumstances where Japanese command would commit maximum fighter strength, where weather conditions favored concealment of American fighters, where operational considerations made the Japanese confident and aggressive. The breakthrough came from intercepted communications. Japanese intelligence had detected increased American bomber activity around the Solomon Islands. They were planning a major fighter sweep to intercept what they believed was a sustained bombing campaign against Rabaul, their critical base in New Britain. "This is it," Chun told Bull, spreading maps across the planning table. April 18th. They're staging over 100 Zeros from multiple bases to intercept an expected American raid. If we position our force to appear as that raid, they'll come in strength. Bull studied the maps, calculating distances, timing, and positioning. "We'll need the B-17s to approach from the south, apparently heading toward Rabaul. The P-38 stage from Port Moresby climbed to altitude before the engagement area. Naval vessels position here and here, creating the kill box." The planning became obsessively detailed. Bull calculated sun angles to maximize glare for concealing fighters. Meteorologists predicted cloud cover patterns. Engineers tested smoke generator durations to ensure consistency. Communications specialists developed coded phrases so American forces could coordinate without revealing the plan to Japanese interceptors. But the human element remained the greatest variable. Bull insisted on personally briefing every pilot and crewman involved in Operation Broken Wing. He visited squadrons, talked with men individually, answered their questions, and most importantly, acknowledged the danger. "Some of you won't come home," Bull told the assembled B-17 crews one evening. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. This plan requires you to fly in a harm's way, to make yourselves targets, to trust that the rest of us will execute perfectly. It's asking more than any commander should ask." A young pilot, Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez, raised his hand. "Colonel, what makes you think this will work?" Bull appreciated the directness. "Because I understand the enemy. Japanese pilots are brave, skilled, and predictable. They'll see what they expect to see: damaged bombers, easy victories. Their training and culture make them commit to individual attacks rather than suspicious defensive tactics. And we've planned for every contingency, every variable we can control." "And the ones you can't control?" another pilot asked. "Then we adapt," Bull replied simply. "But, gentlemen, I've been in combat. I've seen men die following conventional tactics that didn't work. This is unconventional, dangerous, and probably insane. It's also our best chance to hit the enemy so hard they'll feel it for months. That's worth the risk." As April approached, the final preparations intensified. Aircraft were positioned, crews briefed and rebriefed, equipment tested and retested. Bull barely slept, running through scenarios endlessly, looking for flaws, calculating probabilities, and preparing for the moment when theory would meet reality. The point of no return. April 17th, 1942. The eve of Operation Broken Wing found Bull Hartley standing on the flight deck of USS Lexington, watching the sun set over the Coral Sea. Around him, controlled chaos reigned as final preparations proceeded. Mechanics performed last-minute checks on the modified B-17s. Fighter pilots reviewed attack patterns one more time. Naval gunners calibrated their weapons for the coordinated firing sequences that would be critical to the plan's success. Admiral Nimitz had traveled from Pearl Harbor to personally oversee the operation. He found Bull standing alone, smoking his pipe and staring at the horizon. "Having second thoughts, Colonel." "About 100 of them," Bull admitted. "I keep running through the plan, looking for what I've missed." "You've prepared as well as humanly possible," Nimitz said. "At some point, you have to trust the execution." Bull nodded, but didn't look convinced. "In the Argonne, I planned an attack that sent 200 men against a German position everyone said was impregnable. We lost 43 men taking that position. I remember every name, every face. Tomorrow, if this goes wrong, I'll have hundreds more names to remember. And if it goes right," Nimitz countered, You'll have saved thousands of lives by crippling Japanese air power at a critical moment. Command requires making these calculations, Colonel. You know that. The final briefing took place at 2,200 hours in Lexington's ready room. Every pilot, bombardier, navigator, and gunner involved in the operation crowded in. Bull stood before them, the weight of what he was asking them to do evident in every line of his weathered face. Gentlemen, in 8 hours we launched the most unconventional operation in American military aviation history. I won't sugarcoat the risks. Every man in this room volunteered knowing the danger. Some of you may not return, but if we execute as planned, we will deliver a blow to Japanese air power that will be felt across the entire Pacific theater. He unveiled the detailed tactical board showing the complete operation. The B-17 formation departs at 0600 hours, heading northwest toward Rabaul. At 0645, the lead aircraft activates smoke generators and begins erratic flight patterns. Other bombers in the formation gradually fall into disarray, simulating combat damage and formation breakdown. Captain Vandermeer stood to continue the briefing for the fighter component. P-38 squadrons launched from Port Moresby at 0530 hours and climbed to 28,000 feet, positioning northeast of the intercept zone. You maintain radio silence and concealment in cloud cover. At 0720, when Colonel Hartley gives the signal, you dive into the engagement zone. Target priority is Zeros committed to attack runs on the bombers. Commander Mitchell handled the naval coordination element. Destroyers Fletcher and O'Bannon established positions here and here. Cruiser San Francisco anchors the southern kill zone. All vessels maintain minimal profiles until B-17s enter the designated area. When fighters engage, coordinate your AA fire using the colored flare system. Green flares indicate free fire zones. Red flares mean hold fire, friendlies in area. The complexity was staggering. Success required dozens of different units performing specific actions at precise times, all while under fire from an enemy that had proven deadly and aggressive throughout the Pacific campaign. A bombardier raised his hand. Colonel, what happens if the Japanese don't take the bait? What if they see through the deception? Bull had prepared for this question. If they don't commit within 15 minutes of initial contact, I abort the operation. The B-17s turn south, P-38s provide cover for withdrawal, and we live to fight another day. But intelligence indicates they're expecting us and spoiling for a fight. They'll come. Lieutenant Rodriguez asked the question everyone was thinking. What if they come in larger numbers than expected? What if there are more Zeros than we've planned for? Then we adapt, Bull replied. The plan accounts for up to 150 enemy aircraft. If they exceed that number significantly, I'll signal for immediate withdrawal. But gentlemen, understand this. The Japanese think they're intercepting a standard bombing raid. They don't know we're expecting them. They don't know about the fighters waiting above or the naval coordination below. Surprise is our greatest weapon. After the briefing, Bull walked through the ship, visiting crews privately. He shook hands, offered encouragement, and listened to concerns. These personal interactions mattered. Men about to risk their lives deserved to be seen as individuals, not just tactical pieces on a board. He found Lieutenant Rodriguez cleaning his sidearm in the berthing area. Having trouble sleeping, Lieutenant? Just making sure everything's ready, sir, Rodriguez replied. I keep thinking about my crew. They're trusting me to bring them home. Bull sat down beside the young pilot. I flew in the Great War. Different kind of combat, but the fear's the same. You do your job, trust your training, and remember that everyone out there tomorrow is counting on everyone else. That's not just words. It's the only way this works. Were you scared? In the war? Rodriguez asked. Terrified, Bull admitted. Anyone who says they weren't scared in combat is either lying or insane. But you can be scared and still do your job. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. It's panic that kills. At 0300 hours, Bull finally returned to his quarters but didn't sleep. He reviewed the plan one final time, looking for any last-minute adjustments or considerations. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now it came down to execution, luck, and the courage of the men who'd volunteered for this insane operation. He wrote a letter to Martha, knowing she wouldn't receive it for weeks, but needing to put his thoughts down. He didn't tell her about Operation Broken Wing specifically. That was classified, but he wrote about the men he was serving with, about their bravery and dedication, about his confidence that they would succeed because they had to succeed. As dawn approached, Bull stood on the flight deck watching the first light touch the horizon. Somewhere out there, Japanese pilots were preparing for what they thought would be another successful interception of American bombers. They were confident, experienced, and eager for combat. In a few hours, that confidence would be challenged in a way they never anticipated. All aircraft crews to stations, the PA system announced. Operation Broken Wing is go. I repeat, Operation Broken Wing is go. Bull felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression calm. This was it, the point of no return. In minutes, those B-17s would launch, heading into danger based on his plan, his calculations, his belief that conventional thinking wouldn't win this war. He'd asked these men to trust him with their lives. Now he had to prove that trust wasn't misplaced. The dance begins. The 32 B-17 flying fortresses formed up over the Coral Sea at 0615 hours, their polished aluminum bodies catching the early morning sun. From a distance, they looked like any other bomber formation heading toward target. But inside each aircraft, crews were tense with anticipation, knowing they were about to become the most vulnerable bait in military aviation history. Bull Hartley watched from the bridge of USS Lexington, binoculars fixed on the formation. Beside him, Admiral Nimitz maintained his characteristic calm, but Bull could sense the tension. Everything now depended on execution and timing. B-17 formation is on course, the radio operator reported. Approaching waypoint Alpha in 5 minutes. Bull keyed his radio. All broken wing elements, this is Hartley. We are committed. Execute as planned. At 0643 hours, the deception began. The lead B-17, piloted by Lieutenant Rodriguez, activated its smoke generators. White smoke began pouring from the number 2 engine, visible for miles. Rodriguez pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn, then leveled out with the plane yawing slightly, the international signal of an aircraft in trouble. Within 2 minutes, 6 other B-17s had activated their own smoke systems. The tight formation began to loosen, aircraft spreading out as if damaged planes were falling back. Radio chatter filled the airways, carefully scripted but authentic-sounding panic communications. Engine fire. Engine fire. We're losing altitude. Form up. Stay in formation. Can't maintain speed. Falling back. Japanese radio intercept stations were certainly listening. Bull had counted on it. The communications were designed to paint a picture of a bombing raid that had run into unexpected trouble, possibly from a previous fighter interception or mechanical failures. Wounded prey, struggling to reach safety. At 0658 hours, the Japanese took the bait. Radar contact, the Lexington's operator called out. Multiple bogies bearing 320, distance 40 miles and closing fast. Bull felt his stomach tighten. This was the moment. How many? Count is 70, 80, still tracking. Estimate 100-plus aircraft, sir. Admiral Nimitz turned to Bull. They've committed everything. Your intelligence was correct. Bull lifted his radio. All P-38 squadrons, enemy aircraft inbound in strength. Maintain altitude and concealment. Do not, I repeat, do not engage until my signal. High above the B-17s, at 28,000 feet and hidden in scattered cloud cover, 40 P-38 Lightnings waited. Captain Vandermeer listened to the radio traffic and fought every instinct screaming at him to dive to help the bombers. His pilots were equally tense, watching through gaps in the clouds as the Japanese formation approached like a swarm of deadly insects. Steady, Vandermeer told his pilots. Hold your positions. Trust the colonel. The Japanese Zeros came in fast and aggressive, exactly as Bull had predicted. They'd seen the smoke, heard the panic communications, and assumed they were about to massacre a crippled bomber formation. The Zero pilots broke into smaller groups, each selecting targets among the damaged B-17s. Enemy fighters engaging B-17s, the radio operator announced. Multiple aircraft under attack. Bull watched through binoculars as tracers began to light up the sky. The B-17 gunners were returning fire, but they had strict orders not to be too effective. The deception required the Japanese to believe they were facing minimal resistance from damaged, desperate aircraft. A B-17 in the rear of the formation took multiple hits from a zero attack run. Real damage, real danger. Smoke, genuine this time, began pouring from the aircraft as it dropped away from the formation. Bull felt his jaw clench. This was the cost he'd known was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. Steady, Bull muttered, watching the tactical situation develop. Let them commit fully. More Zeros dove in, their pilots confident and aggressive. They were breaking formation now, individual pilots seeking personal victories, exactly as Chun had predicted. The cultural conditioning was playing out perfectly. Japanese pilots couldn't resist the seemingly easy targets before them. Enemy aircraft have committed to attack patterns, the tactical officer reported. Estimate 90% of their force is engaged with the B-17 formation. Bull raised his radio. All P-38 squadrons, this is Hartley. Execute dive attack. I repeat, execute dive attack now. At 28,000 feet, Vandermeer heard the order he'd been waiting for. All lightnings, this is Dutch leader. Tally-ho, let's go to work. 40 P-38s nosed over into steep dives, their twin engines screaming as they accelerated toward the battle below. They came out of the sun, out of the clouds, out of nowhere as far as the Japanese pilots were concerned. The Zeros were focused on the bombers, committed to their attack runs, and completely surprised by the sudden appearance of American fighters diving with tremendous altitude and speed advantages. The first Japanese pilots didn't even see what hit them. P-38s flashed through the Zero formations, their concentrated firepower, 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, devastating at close range. Zeros began exploding, spinning out of control, trailing smoke and debris. Signal naval elements, Bull ordered, commence coordinated firing pattern. Below the aerial battle, the destroyers and cruiser that had been maintaining low profiles suddenly came alive. Their anti-aircraft batteries opened up with perfectly coordinated fire, creating a killing field below the engagement zone. The AA fire wasn't designed to shoot down aircraft randomly. It was designed to drive surviving Zeros upward into the teeth of the diving P-38s. The trap had sprung perfectly. Japanese pilots found themselves caught between diving American fighters above and coordinated naval AA fire below, while the crippled B-17s they'd been attacking suddenly demonstrated far more resilience than expected. The formation tightened up, gunners laid down withering fire, and aircraft that had been smoking mysteriously stopped trailing smoke. "It's working," Admiral Nimitz said quietly, watching the battle unfold. "My God, it's actually working." But Bull remained tense, watching for variables, for problems, for the moment when the Japanese realized the trap and tried to disengage. "We need to keep them pinned for another 5 minutes. That's when we maximize the kill ratio." A Zero pilot, more experienced or intuitive than his comrades, recognized the trap and tried to radio a warning to his squadron. But the American P-38s were everywhere now, and the coordinated attack was relentless. Japanese formations dissolved into individual aircraft fighting for survival. Bull watched as a Zero tried to climb away from the battle, only to be intercepted by a P-38 that had been waiting for exactly that maneuver. Another Zero attempted to dive through the AA fire toward the ocean, hoping to escape at low altitude, but the naval gunners had anticipated that as well. Coordinated fire from multiple ships tracked the aircraft's descent and cut it apart. The battle had become exactly what Bull had designed, a systematic destruction of Japanese air power trapped in a carefully constructed killing field. But it wasn't without cost. AP-38 took fire from a desperate Zero in a head-on pass and spiraled into the ocean. Two B-17s were genuinely crippled now and struggling to maintain altitude. A destroyer took damage from a Zero that turned into a deliberate ramming attack after running out of ammunition. Time check, Bull called out. 17 minutes since engagement began, the tactical officer reported. Signal all aircraft. Begin withdrawal sequence. B-17 south, P-38s provide cover. Naval elements maintain AA suppression for another 3 minutes. Then prepare for emergency recovery of damaged aircraft. The American aircraft began to disengage, but the battle wasn't over. Surviving Zero pilots, realizing they'd been ambushed, fought desperately to salvage something from the disaster. Some tried to pursue the withdrawing bombers. Others targeted the P-38s. A few, following Bushido tradition, turned their damaged aircraft into weapons for final attacks against the naval vessels. But the mathematics were inexorable. The Japanese had come with over 100 fighters. The coordinated American response had destroyed or damaged the majority of them in less than 20 minutes. As the forces separated, the sky was littered with debris, smoke trails, and the awful evidence of combat's brutality. Bull lowered his binoculars and took a shaky breath. They'd done it. The insane plan had worked. But the cost was visible in the damaged aircraft limping home, in the empty spaces where aircraft should be, in the voices on the radio reporting casualties. Now came the hardest part, counting the butcher's bill and determining if the victory had been worth the price. Aftermath of insanity. The returning aircraft painted a stark picture of combat's reality. 11 B-17s were so severely damaged they barely made it back to base, their fuselages riddled with bullet holes, hydraulics failing, crew members wounded. 5 P-38s were missing. Pilots either killed in action or shot down over Japanese-held waters. 2 destroyers had taken damage from suicide attacks, though both remained operational. A cruiser reported casualties from a Zero that had crashed into its superstructure. Bull Hartley stood on the flight line at Port Moresby as aircraft landed throughout the afternoon. Each touchdown brought relief mixed with dread. Relief that another crew had survived, dread about the ones that hadn't. He counted aircraft, checked off names, and prepared himself for the casualty reports that would define Operation Broken Wing's true cost. Lieutenant Rodriguez was among the last to land. His B-17, christened Montana's Pride in honor of Bull's home state, looked like it had flown through hell. The No. 3 engine was completely destroyed, the tail section was Swiss cheese from bullet impacts, and hydraulic fluid leaked from multiple punctures. But Rodriguez had brought his crew home. Bull met him as he climbed down from the aircraft, the young pilot's face showing the strain of nearly 4 hours of combat flying. "Colonel," Rodriguez said simply, then his legs gave out. Bull caught him before he hit the ground. "Medic," Bull called. "Get this man to the infirmary." "My crew," Rodriguez started. "All accounted for," Bull assured him. "2 wounded but stable." "You did well, Lieutenant." As medics took Rodriguez away, Bull walked around Montana's Pride, examining the damage. A squadron mechanic whistled low. "Sir, I count over 200 bullet impacts. I don't know how this bird made it home." "Because her pilot was too stubborn to die," Bull replied. "Can you repair her?" "Give me a week and a lot of parts, maybe." By 1800 hours, preliminary reports began filtering in. Captain Vandermeer found Bull in the operations center, studying maps and intelligence summaries. "Colonel, the initial count is in. We got at least 112 confirmed Zero kills, with another 30 to 40 damaged or probable kills. Intelligence is still analyzing radio intercepts, but it looks like we destroyed roughly 2/3 of the Japanese fighter force in this sector." Bull felt no elation, only exhausted relief. "And our losses?" Vandermeer's expression sobered. 8 aircraft total, 5 P-38s, 3 B-17s. 37 personnel killed in action or missing, 19 wounded. 37 men. Bull had known there would be casualties, had calculated the cost, had accepted it as necessary. But knowing didn't make the names easier to bear. "I want a full list of Kias. I'll write to every family personally." "Sir, that's not required. I asked them to trust me with their lives." Bull interrupted. "The least I can do is explain to their families why they died." Admiral Nimitz arrived that evening, bringing with him representatives from Naval Intelligence and Army Air Forces Command. The conference room was somber as they reviewed Operation Broken Wings results in detail. Commander Chun presented the intelligence assessment. Japanese radio intercepts indicate they're in complete disarray. They lost not just aircraft, but experienced pilots, veterans who'd been fighting since China. The psychological impact may be as significant as the material losses. They believed their Zeros were invincible, and we proved otherwise. What are the strategic implications? Nimitz asked. Immediate air superiority in this sector for at least 3 months, Chun replied. The Japanese will need to pull fighters from other areas to reinforce, which weakens their positions elsewhere. Long-term, they'll be far more cautious about committing their fighter forces to large-scale engagements. Colonel Hartley has introduced uncertainty into their tactical doctrine. But Bull was focused on different numbers. 37 killed, 19 wounded. 11 aircraft will be out of service for weeks. Was it worth it? The room fell silent. Finally, Admiral Nimitz spoke. Colonel, I understand the weight you're carrying. Every commander who's ever led men into combat carries it. But let me give you perspective. In the past 3 months, we've lost over 200 aircraft and pilots in this theater, with minimal impact on Japanese fighter strength. You've reversed that equation in a single engagement. The Admiral's right, Vandermeer added. Before today, our boys were dying in individual dogfights they couldn't win. You've shown there's a way to beat the Zero. That knowledge alone will save lives. Bull wanted to believe that, but the faces of the men he'd sent into danger haunted him. I sent them into a trap I designed. I asked them to make themselves targets. No, Lieutenant Rodriguez said from the doorway, leaning on crutches. He discharged himself from the infirmary against medical advice. You gave us a way to fight back. You gave us a plan that worked. Those men who died, they died winning, not just surviving another day of losing. Rodriguez limped into the room. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. I was scared as hell up there. When those Zeros came at us, I thought we were done. But then the P-38s dropped out of nowhere, and the naval AA lit up, and suddenly we weren't victims. We were part of something bigger. Those men who didn't make it back, they died knowing their sacrifice meant something. That matters, Colonel. Bull studied the young pilot's face, seeing the conviction there. You should be in the infirmary. I should be here, giving you this. Rodriguez pulled a battered notebook from his flight jacket. Every man in my crew signed it. It's a thank you, sir, for treating us like we had brains, for trusting us to do the hard thing, for caring enough to plan something that gave us a fighting chance. Bull took the notebook, feeling its weight. Inside were signatures, brief notes, words of gratitude from men who'd volunteered for one of the most dangerous operations in aviation history. They want you to know something else, Rodriguez continued. Words spreading through the squadrons. Other pilots want to train on the Hartley Protocol. They want to learn how to turn the Zero's strengths into weaknesses. You've shown them it's possible to outsmart an enemy you can't outfight. Admiral Nimitz stood. Colonel Hartley, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Service Medal for Operation Broken Wing. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical innovation we need to win this war. But more importantly, you've given our pilots hope. Bull shook his head. Give the medals to the men who flew today. I just drew up plans. They executed them under fire. They'll get their recognition, Nimitz assured him. But leadership that demands the impossible and then makes it work deserves recognition too. Don't diminish what you've accomplished here. As the meeting broke up, Commander Chun approached Bull privately. Colonel, Japanese propaganda radio is already spinning the battle. They're claiming we used dishonorable tactics by feigning damage. Their pilots feel deceived. Bull felt a grim smile. Good. Maybe that uncertainty will make them hesitate next time, and hesitation gets you killed in combat. That's the point. We got in their heads. There's something else, Chun said quietly. Intelligence intercepted a message from the Japanese fighter command to their pilots. They're being told to beware the wounded bird and to suspect any American formation that appears damaged. You force them to change their entire tactical doctrine. Until they adapt, Bull noted, we've got maybe one more chance to use this strategy before they're ready for it. Then we better make that chance count, Chun replied. Because you've proven unconventional thinking wins wars. Admiral Nimitz wants you planning more operations like this. Bull looked out at the flight line, where mechanics were working through the night to repair damaged aircraft. Crews were already volunteering for the next mission, whatever it might be. The war wasn't won, wasn't even close. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Pacific had dealt a decisive blow to the enemy. 37 men had died, making that possible. Bull would carry their names for the rest of his life. But Rodriguez was right. They died winning, not just surviving. In war, sometimes that was the best you could hope for. The insane plan had worked. Now Bull had to figure out what insane plan came next. Legacy of the Broken Wing. The news of Operation Broken Wing spread through the Pacific theater like wildfire, transforming from classified operation to legend in a matter of weeks. Pilots who'd felt helpless against Japanese Zeros suddenly saw possibilities. Commanders who'd accepted aerial combat losses as inevitable began demanding innovative tactics. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the immediate strategic gains. Bull Hartley found himself in demand. Naval commanders wanted him to design similar operations for carrier-based aircraft. Army Air Force generals requested he develop training programs teaching the principles behind the Hartley Protocol. Intelligence officers sought his input on Japanese tactical behavior and how to exploit it. The retired Montana rancher had become one of the most influential tactical minds in the Pacific War. But Bull remained focused on the human cost. He'd written 37 letters to families of the men killed in Operation Broken Wing. Personal notes explaining how their loved ones had contributed to a victory that would save countless other lives. Several families wrote back, thanking him for the context and detail. One mother sent a photograph of her son, asking Bull to keep it as a reminder of what the sacrifice had meant. In June 1942, Bull was summoned to Pearl Harbor for a ceremony. Admiral Nimitz personally presented him with the Distinguished Service Medal, but Bull insisted the entire surviving crew of Operation Broken Wing be present to receive their own recognition. Lieutenant Rodriguez, fully recovered from his wounds, stood beside Bull as naval aviators and Army Air Force pilots received Silver Stars, Distinguished Flying Crosses, and Air Medals. This medal belongs to every man who trusted an insane plan, Bull said in his brief acceptance speech. They took the risk. They executed under fire. They proved that courage combined with smart tactics can overcome any enemy advantage. I just showed them what was possible. They made it reality. The strategic impact of Operation Broken Wing became clear over subsequent months. Japanese fighter forces in the South Pacific never recovered their pre-April strength. The balance of air power shifted decisively in favor of American forces, enabling aggressive operations that would have been impossible earlier. Naval aviators cited the operation as proof that tactical innovation could overcome technological disadvantages. But perhaps more importantly, the operation changed how American forces approached aerial combat. The doctrine of the wounded bird became standard training for bomber crews. Fighter squadrons developed coordinated tactics based on Bull's principles of exploiting enemy predictability. The integration of naval AA fire with air combat became a refined art, creating multi-layered defensive networks that Japanese attackers could never predict. Commander Chun compiled a detailed analysis of Japanese tactical responses to Operation Broken Wing, documenting how enemy fighter doctrine evolved in reaction to the ambush. They're more cautious now, Chun told Bull during a planning session. They don't automatically pursue damaged aircraft. They maintain formation discipline longer. They're learning. Good, Bull replied. An enemy that's cautious is an enemy that's lost confidence. That's worth as much as the planes we destroyed. Captain Vandermeer, promoted to major for his role in Operation Broken Wing, worked with Bull to develop advanced training scenarios. We're teaching pilots to think like you, Colonel, to see beyond the immediate tactical situation, to understand how enemy psychology and culture create exploitable patterns. The success of Operation Broken Wing led to Operation Broken Fong in July 1942, another coordinated ambush that destroyed 73 Japanese aircraft. Then came Operation Wounded Eagle in September and Operation Ghost Squadron in November. Each refined the tactical principles Bull had pioneered, each adapted to evolving enemy responses, each contributing to the slow erosion of Japanese air power. By December 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the strategic situation in the Pacific had transformed. American forces held air superiority in critical sectors. Japanese commanders were reluctant to commit fighters to large-scale engagements. The tide was turning, slowly but inexorably. Bull received promotion to brigadier general and assignment to Pacific Fleet Planning Staff, but he insisted on remaining involved with operational tactics rather than strategic planning. "I'm a problem solver, not a diplomat," he told Admiral Nimitz. "Keep me where I can help the pilots who actually do the fighting." He continued refining the principles that had made Operation Broken Wing successful. Working with psychologists and intelligence officers, Bull developed detailed profiles of enemy tactical behavior based on cultural conditioning and training doctrine. These profiles became the foundation for tactical deception operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. Lieutenant Rodriguez, now Captain Rodriguez, commanded a bomber squadron that specialized in the complex coordinated operations Bull had pioneered. "The old man changed everything," Rodriguez told new pilots during training. "Before him, we were just trying to survive each mission. He showed us we could win by making the enemy fight on our terms." In early 1943, Bull received an unusual visitor at Pearl Harbor, a Japanese fighter pilot who defected after witnessing the devastation of Operation Broken Wing. Through an interpreter, the pilot described the psychological impact of the ambush on surviving Zero pilots. "We believed we were invincible," the pilot said. "The Zero was superior, our training was superior, our spirit was superior. Then came the wounded birds that weren't wounded, the fighters that appeared from nowhere, the coordinated fire that seemed to predict our every move. You made us doubt ourselves." Bull listened carefully. "What did your commanders tell you?" "They said Americans fight without honor, using deception and tricks. But we knew the truth. You had simply fought smarter than us. That was more frightening than any aircraft or weapon. Intelligence can defeat courage." This conversation reinforced Bull's understanding that psychological warfare was as important as tactical execution. He began incorporating lessons learned from defectors and prisoners into his operational planning, creating an evolving tactical doctrine that stayed ahead of Japanese adaptations. By mid-1943, Bull was involved in planning for operations that would eventually lead to the island-hopping campaign, the Philippines' liberation, and ultimately the defeat of Japan. But he never forgot the lessons of that April morning when 32 B-17s had deliberately made themselves targets to spring the trap he designed. He kept Lieutenant Rodriguez's notebook in his desk, pulling it out when doubt crept in about the costs of war. The signatures reminded him that men would accept extraordinary risks if they believed their leaders had a plan that made sense, that treated them as intelligent professionals rather than expendable resources. In 1945, when victory in the Pacific was finally achieved, Bull Hartley returned to Montana. He was 65 years old, tired, and ready to be just a cattle rancher again. But the war had changed him, just as he'd changed the war. The obscure retired soldier who'd reported for duty after Pearl Harbor had become a legend in tactical aviation circles. He never spoke publicly about Operation Broken Wing, maintaining the military's classification restrictions. But pilots who'd served under him spread the story. Veterans told their children about the insane plan that had worked, and military historians eventually uncovered the details of the operation that had changed aerial combat doctrine. Bull died in 1967 at 87 years old on his Montana ranch. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in both World Wars but provided few details. He'd requested no military funeral, no speeches, no ceremonies. Just a simple burial next to Martha, who'd passed away 5 years earlier. But at his graveside, something unexpected happened. Over 200 former military pilots attended, many having traveled from across the country. They stood in silence as taps played, Then each walked by the grave and dropped a small token, a piece of zero wreckage, a mission patch, a photograph, a medal. Captain Rodriguez, himself retired and gray-haired, gave the only eulogy. Bull Hartley asked men to do the impossible, and then he showed them how it was possible. He never asked anyone to take a risk he hadn't calculated, never treated us as expendable, never forgot the human cost of war. He was the rarest kind of commander, one who cared enough to think differently, to challenge doctrine, to be called insane if it meant saving lives. The world won't remember his name the way it remembers famous generals and admirals. But every pilot who survived the Pacific War, because tactical innovation gave them a fighting chance, owes him a debt. In the years after Bull's death, Operation Broken Wing was declassified and became a case study in military academies worldwide. The principles he'd pioneered, exploiting enemy psychology, coordinating multi-domain operations, using tactical deception, and training personnel to execute complex plans under fire, became fundamental to modern military doctrine. The insane trick that took down 150 Japanese Zeros. The final confirmed count was actually 147, but legends rarely worry about such precision. Had started as one retired soldier's refusal to accept that conventional thinking could win an unconventional war. Bull Hartley had looked at an impossible problem and refused to believe it was impossible. He'd studied the enemy not just as a military force, but as people with predictable behaviors shaped by culture and training. He'd trusted the men under his command to execute something unprecedented. And in doing so, he'd proven that wars aren't won solely by superior technology or numbers, but by superior thinking, by leaders willing to risk their reputations on unorthodox ideas, and by soldiers brave enough to trust in plans that seem insane until the moment they work. The legacy of the Broken Wing lives on not just in military history, but in the fundamental truth Bull Hartley demonstrated, that courage and intelligence, properly combined, can overcome any advantage an enemy possesses. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to be stronger or faster. It's to be smarter, more creative, and just crazy enough to try something no one else would dare attempt. That Montana rancher who'd never wanted to fight in another war had helped change the course of the greatest conflict in human history, not through traditional heroics, but through the power of unconventional thinking. And in the end, that was the most powerful weapon of all.